So for this video, I want to talk about the best female characters written by Stephen King. Now, as y'all know, Stephen King's one of my all-time favorite authors, and one of my favorite things about Stephen King is his ability to create wonderful and interesting characters. That being said, Stephen King is not always the best at portraying female characters. And if you take a look at most of his books, I would probably say that most of his books have a male POV, or most of the POVs in the books are male, but he does have a lot of very interesting, nuanced, great female characters, and that's what this video is going to be all about. I was going to do a top 10, but I've kind of narrowed it down to 10 books, and then 2 of those books have 2 fantastic female characters. So I actually have 10 books to talk about, but 12 outstanding female characters written by Stephen King, of course. And I'm not going to rank them. I'm going to go mostly in chronological order, but I am going to save my 2 favorite female Stephen King characters for the very end. So you're going to get 10, and then you're going to get my 2 absolute favorites, which, if you've watched my channel for the last couple of years, probably no surprise as what my 2 favorites are. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first off, I said that I'm going to be going in publication order, and Stephen King's very first published novel has 2 incredible female characters, and that would be Carrie, all the way from 1974, 50 years ago, which is still crazy. But the 2 characters I'm talking about is, of course, the titular character of Carrie White, and then her mother, Margaret White. I would say my main love for this book are those 2 characters, Carrie White and Margaret White. Carrie is just such an interesting character because some people would argue that she's the villain of the story, but for me, her mother, Margaret White, is the true villain of the story because she's just such an oppressive figure in Carrie's life. She's very strict. She's kind of a religious nut, and just the way that she treats Carrie kind of ultimately harkens back to Carrie's ability that she gains and all the chaos that ensues because of that. So it's an interesting dynamic because obviously Carrie, if you've read the book, she does some pretty questionable things by the end of the book, a little bit, a lot of it. But Margaret White really, man, her character really gets under my skin. But from his very first book, you can see that he is capable of writing interesting and nuanced female characters. Carrie White and her mother, Margaret White, both very good, and I had to include both of them in here. But yeah, right from the start, 1974, great female character work. Also from the 70s, we have The Shining. Obviously, I'm talking about Wendy Torrance, kind of the mother figure of the Torrance family, of them going up to the Overlook Hotel. And maybe if y'all have seen the movie, kind of Wendy Torrance, even though I love that movie, she's not necessarily like the best female character of all time. But in the book, you definitely get a lot more of her POV and just everyone's kind of backstory and inner monologue and thought process, and you definitely get a lot of that with her character in here. And he goes very well into depth about her past and then what she thinks about the situation as a whole. And also, she's a very resourceful character because, you know, I won't spoil anything, but some bad stuff happens at the Overlook Hotel and she has to actually do stuff about it, and very capable, very intriguing character. So I had to include Wendy Torrance in my top female characters written by Stephen King. So next up, we have a kid character, and Stephen King is, of course, well known for writing really compelling kid characters, and this happens to be a very good female kid character, and that would be Charlie McGee from Firestarter. And one of my all-time favorite Stephen King novels, and mainly because of the father-daughter duo of Charlie McGee and her father, which for some reason I can't remember the name of. But that being said, my main love for this book is Charlie McGee. And of course, Firestarter, she can light shit on fire with her mind, which is really cool. But also just, you know, getting the perspective of a little kid and like what's going on, and like this secret government agency is trying to kidnap her. A lot of bad stuff happens to her in this book, but she's very, you know, resourceful, and she's very fiery, pun intended. And yeah, she's one of my all-time favorite kid characters. And yeah, I love this book mainly because of Charlie McGee and the father-daughter duo that it has in it. So yeah, Charlie McGee, fantastic character. Next book I have here is Pet Sematary, and I'm actually going to go with Rachel Creed, Louis Creed's wife. And if you guys know me, and if you've seen my Pet Sematary rant review, you guys know that I don't love this book. In fact, I think it is one of his most overrated books. I give this book 3 stars. And if you've seen that review, you know that I kind of have the unpopular opinion that this book would have been way more interesting if we got the book from Rachel Creed's POV. This whole book is mainly told from the husband's POV, Louis Creed. He's a doctor and he knows a lot about death, and kind of a lot of the main events are happening to him. But I think this book would have been way more compelling from Rachel Creed's perspective, because she has a very interesting and just, I don't know how to describe it, but she has a very interesting relationship with death. She really kind of is in denial about it. She's had, the sister in her past named Zelda who had this really bad disease. And so she has a really bad relationship with death, and she kind of wants nothing to do with it. And then obviously by the end of this book, or well, not the end of, well, a lot of this book, she's having to deal with it. And I think it would have been more compelling from that POV, because Louis Creed, he kind of deals with death a lot being a doctor. So he's kind of coming at it from a more scientific mind, which I don't think is as compelling, but I think it would have been creepier to get it from Rachel Creed's POV. So that's probably an unpopular opinion, but that's how much I really enjoyed her character. And the chapters that we do get from her POV, really good. And I think getting the whole book from her POV, having things happen to her in that way, would have been very compelling. So for that reason, I do think Rachel Creed is a fantastic character. I actually wish we would have gotten more of her. And like I mentioned, when Stephen King writes novels, a lot of the times it's from the male POV, and when he has a cast of characters, most of them are male. But in this chunky book, you can probably guess what it is. He does have a lot of male POVs, but the one female POV in here, Beverly Marsh, really outstanding, one of the members of the Losers Club. Her story is very tragic, and both childhood and adult. So getting those dual POVs from her younger self and adult self, fully realized character. She has a lot of great moments in here. Maybe not at the very end, if you guys know what that scene's about. But overall, her character, very well fleshed out. Very good character development from Stephen King, as usual. And yeah, she's one of my favorite members of the Losers Club. And then we have the character of Jessie from Gerald's Game. And if you don't know, this novel is pretty interesting because the whole novel is basically told from her POV. And she's basically, for the bulk of this book, she's the only real character in the book. If you don't know, it's about a husband and wife that go up to this lone cabin, and they decide to have this kind of weird kinky sex thing where she's handcuffed to the bed, but something happens and the husband dies. He's dead on the floor and she's handcuffed to the bed, and she has no idea how to escape. And that's basically the book. She's stuck to this bed, and you wouldn't think it would be that compelling, but for me, extremely compelling, mainly because Jessie is a compelling character, and you get the whole book basically as an inner monologue of what's going on, how is she going to cope with all of this, what she's going to do to get out of it, all of the crazy stuff that happened to her in the past. So this whole book really hinges on having a great character, and Jessie is definitely one of the best female characters ever from Stephen King. So yeah, definitely check this book out if you haven't already, especially if that premise sounds good and if the character sounds interesting at all, because she's fantastic. Next up, we have a female character that's in multiple Stephen King books. That's just one of my all-time favorites, and that would be Susanna from the Dark Tower series. I'm holding up Song of Susanna just because that's a fitting title for here. But yeah, Susanna is introduced first in the Dark Tower second book. I can speak. The second Dark Tower book, The Drawing of the Three. That's kind of the introduction of her character. And just from that moment on, seeing her origin story and then just seeing the progression of what she has to go through and the relationships she has along the journey to the Dark Tower, just excellent. One of the most realized Stephen King characters, not only female, but just any character. Stephen King just knocks it out of the park. I would say probably Eddie is my favorite Dark Tower character, but Susanna is probably a close second because she is just amazing. And some of the scenes she has in this series are just completely unforgettable and just fantastic stuff. And yeah, I love her. Another one of my all-time favorite female characters and kid characters is Trisha McFarland. If you don't know who that is, that's maybe because you haven't read this book or you forgot about it. I don't know. But I'm talking, of course, about the girl from The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. If you don't know, this is actually the very first Stephen King book that I read. And probably not the best idea because I did not love this book and I did not really return to Stephen King until adulthood. Read this book in middle grade, was kind of like, it's about a little girl who gets lost in the woods and she loves baseball, whatever. But reading this as an adult, it can be pretty terrifying because you realize like how scary it is to actually have a kid lost in the woods. And yeah, Trisha McFarland, just one of the best female kid characters Stephen King has ever written. And the things that she has to go through in this book, pretty terrifying to read as an adult, honestly. And yeah, she's awesome. The only thing, she's not like upper echelon for me just because I'm not a big baseball fan and she clearly loves baseball. But yeah, that's kind of the only fault I have with her character. But, you know, that's just a hobby. Like, it is what it is. But I do really love her personality. I do love her character. So yeah, she definitely is deserving to be on this list. So I was going to save two of my favorite characters for the end, but I also forgot that there's another character in one of these books that's not like one of my all-time favorites, but she's also in this book. But then once I reveal that book, you're going to obviously know who is one of my top two characters. So I'm just going to jump into it. And yeah, the book I'm talking about is Dolores Claiborne. But forget about that person for a moment. I'm talking about Vera Donovan. And Vera Donovan is actually Dolores Claiborne's employer. Dolores Claiborne is her caretaker or one of her caretakers. And they have an interesting relationship when you're first figuring it out. But once you get further in, because at the start you're just like, oh, Vera Donovan's just like kind of a rich asshole who just pays her employers very little, but asks so much of them, just very demanding, and everything has to be just super specific. Like it's got to be done this way or you're fired kind of deal. So at the first few chapters or so, you're just kind of like, man, this person just, does she have any redeeming qualities? But then you get further into the book and then something really interesting happens. You get a reveal and then you get further on and both of the characters are aging and just, she quickly becomes a favorite character of mine at least. And yeah, she's just one of the more compelling female characters that Stephen King has ever written and definitely deserving to be on this list. And now, of course, we're coming to the top two, and obviously you probably know who one of them is. Dolores Claiborne, and then the other one, I'll just mention them both. It's Annie Wilkes from Misery. So that's my top two. And I always flip-flop back and forth between which one's my favorite. I would say probably the more enjoyable one is Dolores Claiborne just because her character, she's just not afraid to say whatever's on her mind. She's hilarious at times, very poignant at times in her own way. And yeah, this story, it's interesting because the first time I read this, I read it physically and I liked it, but I didn't love it. But then doing the audiobook for it, that narrator really brings out Dolores's personality. And just, from that point on, she became one of my favorite Stephen King characters, not even just female, but anybody. And yeah, she's very compelling, very funny, but just, this book is so good. So definitely check it out if you haven't already. But also, Annie Wilkes, probably my favorite villain that Stephen King has ever written. So just for that alone, she's in the top two. Annie Wilkes is just, oh man, if you don't know by now, Misery is about this author named Paul Sheldon, who is a very famous writer who kind of gets into this nasty car wreck, and then Annie Wilkes basically saves her life, but also keeps him captive, and then she's his number one fan, and then she kind of forces him to write a new book in her favorite book series, and it just goes off the wall nuts, and I love her character so much. So it's really hard to choose between Dolores and Annie Wilkes. A gun to my head, probably Annie Wilkes, just because she's like my favorite like villain Stephen King's ever done. This is my second favorite novel he's ever done. But Dolores, like for me, it's more like they're both my favorite. So it's really hard to choose between the two. But yeah, those are definitely my favorites. All right, so that is kind of like my top 12 Stephen King female characters of all time, with obviously Dolores Claiborne and Annie Wilkes taking the top 2 spots. They're just amazing. But also you've got Carrie White and Margaret White from Carrie. just knocked it out of the park 50 years ago, which is nuts. You got Wendy Torrance from The Shining. You got Charlie McGee from Firestarter. You got Rachel Creed from Pet Sematary, which might surprise some people that she's on this list. But like I said, that story just would have been more interesting from her point of view. You've got Beverly Marsh from It, one of my favorite members of the Losers Club. You've got Jessie from Gerald's Game, which that book doesn't really work unless you have a fantastic female character. You've got Trisha McFarland from The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. You've got Susanna from the Dark Tower series. She's probably like my third favorite, honestly, because I've read so many pages of her because she's in, like 7 of the Dark Tower books. So, yeah, fantastic. And then Vera Donovan, also from Dolores Claiborne, one of my all-time favorites. But yeah, Dolores Claiborne and Annie Wilkes, just so good. But yeah, that's my list. Definitely let me know what you think of my list. Let me know if you disagree or agree with any of my picks. Also, which female characters am I missing? I will probably do a part 2 of this where I'm going to be talking about all the female characters that just missed out, and I would consider them underrated female characters. Like, they'd probably be in my top 20 or so. I'll probably make a part 2 to this, and then anyone who's missing from my video, in your opinion, maybe they'll make it into that list. Maybe. We'll see. But yeah, I'm thinking of making a part 2 to this. But definitely leave down in the comments below if you agree or disagree with me, and in your opinion, who was snubbed from this list. So who are your favorite female characters written by Stephen King? I want to know. Write it down in the comments below and we'll chat about it. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We've got the Book of Shermer Discord where we still got the Stephen King book club going. We're doing different seasons right now. Everyone's having a great time with it, so I'm definitely glad to hear that. I've also got my Patreon link down below if you want to go support me there for as little as $1 a month. And I've got my Amazon wish list if you want to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching and have a fantastic day. My 2 favorites are Dolores and Annie Wilkes. Okay. They're right at the end. Okay. Leave me alone. You're going to not like the first one. Yep. Go and read your damn book.